For those of you that don't know, West Coast Canada is hilariously white. However, did you know that Victoria used to have a large African-American colony that came up from San Francisco in the 1850s? And remnants of this colony are still present today, particularly in Salt Spring Island, of all places. Keep a very long, violent, and depressingly horrible history short, it really sucked to be black in the 1840s and 1850s United States. The horrible social realities that existed between slave and free states led to scenarios where freed black men could be enslaved just by being plucked off the streets and being thrown onto a plantation. This social tension culminated in the Dred Scott case, where African Americans were essentially second-class citizens in the United States, and then that eventually boiled over into the Civil War that we love and know. However, one of the biggest social events that occurred right before the Civil War was the California Gold Rush of the 1840s/1850s, where most famously the 49ers marched across the continent of the United States or came around by ship up to Sacramento or San Francisco. The California Gold Rush, is all gold rushes end, where everything kind of runs dry and all the stakes have been claimed. So this led to a scenario where many young men who were either skilled or unskilled were just left with nothing really to do if they didn't get involved in other previous business ventures. The opportunity passed them by. California back then had little to no law, and as such, this led to scenarios where there was ridiculous numbers of disenfranchised young people who turned to crime, and it was pretty bad, in fact, actually. I recommend reading Sisters Brothers and imagining that in the same vein of violence as Blood Meridian. That's kind of what you get with California in the 1850s. And a tale as old as time itself. If you don't have money in California, life kind of sucks. So when word spread that there was a brand new source of gold up along the Simon Fraser River up in British Columbia, many of these disenfranchised miners thought, well, okay, round two, let's go. The first ship that left from San Francisco, called the Commodore, it arrived in spring of 1858 into Fort Victoria. And amongst that group of people was Mifflin Worcester Gibbs and about 24 or so other African Americans, where he actually negotiated and spoke specifically with Governor Douglas in order to set up a colony of African American people due to being disenfranchised in California. Long story short, most African American settlers ended up going back to the United States, particularly during and after the American Civil War. This is largely due to the fact that there was more land readily available, and it was available for a fraction of the cost when all these individuals now who weren't afraid of having to get thrown back into slavery were completely enfranchised and had the rights given back to them after the American Civil War. But there were, of course, exceptions, one of which is the Stark and the Estes family, which eventually set up shop up in Salt Spring Island, which is a little bit north of the city itself, right off the Saanich Peninsula, really close to where I grew up, actually. The Stark and the Estes family were there for generations, and as far as I can tell, their descendants are still there to this very day, which is pretty darn skookum, if I have to say so myself. The family themselves did very well, but they did have some troubles. In the 1860s, there was a lot of native warriors that would sometimes just barge into their houses and, just steal things. And there were actually a couple black settlers that were murdered as well. And in the 1890s, when the family kind of split up a little bit, the family that was staying outside of Nanaimo in the Cranberry district, the head of that household, Lewis Stark, was, I think, murdered, but in this newspaper clipping it said he fell off a cliff. And, the consensus is that there was foul play involved because his property was on a massive coal seam, and the Dunsmuir family, who had a virtual monopoly on the entirety of coal in Vancouver Island, they really wanted that coal seam. Overall, the African-American colony of Vancouver Island is a very fascinating yet short period of Canadian history that directly comes from Dred Scott being a factor in 1857. And today is, in fact, actually the anniversary of that decision being made, March 6, 1857. Unfortunately, many African Americans did not want to stay on Vancouver Island or in British Columbia in general, largely because of expenses rather than social prejudices. And, well, when the American Civil War ended and all the rights were given back to them, they didn't really see much of an economic point. It was so bad that you could buy hundreds of acres for what you were getting for like 1 acre on Vancouver Island. That's how much of an economic disparity was available due to Hudson's Bay overreach. Some 30,000 American miners came up from California in 1858, at a time when there was only about 1,000 or so Brits of anywhere on Vancouver Island or British Columbia combined. As such, this led to a period where British Columbia was heavily Americanized, and that's kind of a reality we see today. The Pacific Northwest, when you connect it all, it includes Vancouver and Victoria, I sound American. I don't sound Canadian at all. Overall, I find the culture around American history such as this is extraordinarily fascinating. And the fact that it's not discussed further within the overarching Canadian and American experience, rather ironic and sad.